The market square stank of wet leather and spoiled grain, a nauseating mixture that hung heavy in the stifling August air. Dust rose in choking clouds as a battered wagon creaked into view, its front wheel wobbling precariously like it might snap in half at any moment. The wood was weathered and split, the metal fittings rusted from countless journeys across the unforgiving frontier. In the back of this sorry conveyance, tied to a crude wooden chair with frayed rope that had seen better days, sat a young Apache girl whose presence commanded attention despite her circumstances. Her legs lay twisted beneath a threadbare wool blanket, motionless and useless since the fever had stolen her strength months ago. The blanket, once perhaps a vibrant pattern, had faded to muted browns and grays, much like hope itself in this forsaken place. The trader who owned this human cargo climbed down from his perch with the casual indifference of a man who had long ago sold his conscience along with his wares. He was a weathered, cruel-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes that held no warmth. He spit a stream of brown juice into the dirt, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and shouted with the practiced volume of a carnival barker, "She can't walk, she can't work, eats more than she earns." His voice carried across the square, drawing curious onlookers like vultures to carrion. Anyone want her? If not, he smirked with sadistic pleasure, pointing at the mangy dogs that had begun sniffing around the wagon wheels, their ribs showing through patchy fur. "She's meat." A ripple of cruel laughter broke through the gathered crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Women in their bonnets and worn dresses turned their heads away in feigned disgust while secretly listening to every word. Men in dusty work clothes chuckled with the kind of cruel amusement that comes from finding entertainment in another's misfortune. The girl stared straight ahead, her jaw set with a determination that seemed carved from stone, her dark eyes burning like embers in a dying fire. Not a tear escaped those eyes, not a plea crossed her lips. Only silence, dignified and unbreaking, emanated from her small form tied to that chair. One man in the crowd, his voice carrying just loud enough to be heard, whispered with casual cruelty, "Worth less than a saddle, that one." Another observer, emboldened by the mob mentality, spat into the dust and declared, "Even the Comanche wouldn't trade a horse for her." The comments grew bolder, each person trying to outdo the last in their heartless assessment of human worth. The trader, feeding off the crowd's energy like a parasite, barked again with renewed vigor, "Who'll take her? Who'll claim the burden?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring someone, anyone, to step forward and prove they possessed even a shred of human decency. Then, cutting through the cacophony of cruel voices, boots struck dirt with purpose and authority. A tall rancher stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his hat brim casting a shadow that obscured his eyes, but not his intent. He stood alone in that moment, no family at his side to support his decision, no hired men behind him to back his play. Just a man and his word, standing against the tide of human indifference. His presence seemed to shift the very air in the square, commanding attention without demanding it. His voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk, low, firm, and final. "She's not garbage." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. The trader, taken aback by this unexpected challenge to his authority, sneered with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Then what is she?" he demanded, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disdain. The rancher's eyes never left the girl, never wavered from her face as he spoke words that would echo through time. His voice didn't rise, didn't need to shout to be heard, but it carried the weight of a man who'd buried too much already, who'd seen too much suffering to remain silent any longer. "She's stronger than I'll ever be." The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into a still pond, creating ripples that would spread far beyond that dusty market square. The crowd fell silent as if struck dumb by lightning. Even the dogs stilled their sniffing and padding around the wagon. And in that profound hush, something miraculous happened. The girl's lips trembled, just barely, her first flicker of life in hours, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, Someone had seen her as more than a body in a chair, more than a burden to be discarded. The trader, his bluff called and his authority challenged, barked a laugh that held no real mirth. "You want her? Take her then. Don't bring her back when she starves you out." His bravado was hollow now, deflated by the rancher's quiet strength. The rancher moved with deliberate care, his hands rough and scarred from years of hard work, but gentle as he untied the rope that bound her to the chair. He lifted her as if she were not broken, but sacred, cradling her with a reverence that spoke of deep respect. She braced herself for him to flinch at her weight, to show some sign of regret or second thoughts, but he didn't. Instead, he carried her to his horse with the steady gait of a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed. He set her carefully in the saddle, positioned himself to walk beside her, and together they left the square without looking back at the whispers that followed in their wake. The crowd erupted in whispers that grew to murmurs that threatened to become shouts. "Crazy fool," someone muttered. "She'll drain him dry," another predicted with the certainty of a prophet. "Man's lonely enough to marry a ghost," came a particularly cruel assessment. But the rancher, now revealed as Cade Walker, didn't look back, didn't acknowledge their words, didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. He simply walked beside his horse, his hand occasionally reaching up to steady the girl as they made their way out of that place of judgment and into whatever future awaited them. His name was Cade Walker, and he carried the weight of 35 years, each one marked by loss and loneliness. He was a widower, a man who had watched his wife succumb to fever, who had buried dreams along with the child that never drew breath. His ranch stood like a monument to solitude, quiet as a grave, echoing with memories of what might have been. The buildings were solid, well-maintained, but empty of the laughter and warmth that makes a house a home. The girl's name was Taya, and though she was only 17, she had already lived more tragedy than most people see in a lifetime. She had been orphaned when soldiers burned her village, the flames consuming not just buildings, but an entire way of life. A fever had left her legs numb and useless, but it had not touched her will, had not dimmed the fire that burned in her spirit. She was young in years, but ancient in suffering, wise beyond her time in the ways of loss and survival. That first night on Cade's ranch, under a sky filled with more stars than seemed possible, Cade built a fire that crackled and popped in the darkness. He set Taya carefully in a chair by the flames, close enough to feel their warmth, but far enough to be safe from sparks. He poured water from a tin pitcher into a cup, the sound of liquid hitting metal unnaturally loud in the silence. He slid a plate of beans her way without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, just the simple act of providing sustenance to another human being. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, her dark eyes never leaving his face as she studied this man who had changed her life with a few simple words. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying all the weight of confusion and hope and fear that comes with unexpected kindness. Cade looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, perhaps seeing in them the ghosts of his own past, the faces of those he'd lost, the dreams that had turned to ash. When he spoke, his words were simple but profound, "Because you didn't beg." Days turned into weeks, with the steady rhythm of routine and gradual trust. Taya spoke little in those early days, her words carefully measured and chosen, but she watched everything with the intensity of someone learning a new language, the language of kindness without expectation. She watched Cade haul water from the well every morning, the muscles in his back straining against his shirt as he worked the pump. She watched him mend fences with patient precision, his hands working the wire and wood with the skill of years. She watched him work cattle from dawn to dark, moving with the easy grace of a man born to ranch life. She watched him leave food at her table without a word, without ceremony, treating her not as an object of pity but as a person deserving of basic dignity. Understanding that independence was as important as kindness, Cade spent his evenings in his workshop, building something special for Taya. He constructed a hand-crank cart, a marvel of simple engineering that would allow her to move between the porch and the barn under her own power. He cut wood planks with careful attention to smoothness and fit, sanded them until they were silk smooth to the touch, and fitted wheels that he salvaged from an old wagon and restored to perfect working order. Every joint was secure, every surface finished to prevent splinters, every detail considered with the care of a craftsman creating something precious. The first time Taya pushed herself into the sunlight using her new cart, the wind lifted her long black hair like a banner of freedom. The sensation of movement under her own control, of choosing her direction and speed, was intoxicating. For the first time since her paralysis had stolen her mobility, she smiled, not just a polite curve of lips, but a genuine expression of joy that transformed her entire face. But Cade, understanding the importance of dignity, never made a show of noticing her pleasure. He only tipped his hat in acknowledgement and said with casual warmth, "Sun feels better out here," treating her joy as natural and expected rather than remarkable. One morning, as spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter, Cade approached with something new. He brought his calmest mare to the fence, a gentle bay with intelligent eyes and a patient temperament. "You ever ride?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes watching her reaction carefully. Taya's hands tightened involuntarily on the wheels of her cart, knuckles white with sudden tension. The question brought back memories of another life, when her legs were strong and sure, when horses carried her across the plains like the wind itself. "Not since I could stand," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of loss and longing. Cade, with the ingenuity born of necessity and compassion, built a frame using ropes and a wooden step, creating a system that would allow Taya to mount the horse safely despite her paralysis. With infinite patience and careful movements, he lifted her onto the saddle, his hands steady and sure as he positioned her legs and helped her find her balance. Her hands shook as they gripped the leather reins, muscle memory warring with the fear of falling, of failing, of being helpless once again. The mare, sensing her rider's nervousness, shifted slightly, and Taya gasped, her balance wavering as panic threatened to overwhelm her. But Cade was there, his strong hands steadying her, his presence a rock of calm in her storm of fear. "If you fall?" he asked, his voice gentle but challenging. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears of frustration and terror. "Then I fall," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute determination. "And?" he prompted, waiting for her to find the strength within herself. She gritted her teeth, lifted her chin, and declared with fierce resolve, "I get back up." For the first time since they'd met, Cade smiled, not just a pleasant expression, but a grin of pure pride and admiration that lit up his entire face. But their peaceful existence couldn't remain undisturbed forever. Word had spread through the territory like wildfire, a white rancher keeping an Apache cripple, treating her like family instead of property. The whispers grew louder and more insistent until they reached the wrong ears. One day, a man rode up to the ranch with official-looking papers clutched in his weathered hand and authority stamped across his features. "I'm her uncle," he declared without preamble, waving the documents like a weapon. "Got legal claim. She belongs with me." Cade's entire demeanor changed, his easy manner replaced by something harder, more dangerous. His eyes narrowed to slits as he studied the man, taking in everything from his expensive clothes to his soft hands to the cruelty that lurked behind his righteous facade. "She belongs to no man," Cade replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. The uncle, emboldened by his legal documents and his assumed superiority, waved the paper more vigorously. "Law says otherwise," he insisted, his voice rising with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Cade stepped closer, deliberately invading the man's space, his shadow falling across the mounted figure like a storm cloud blocking the sun. His voice remained calm, but underneath the calm was something far more dangerous than shouting. "Law doesn't feed her, law doesn't guard her, law doesn't care if she lives or dies. You want her? You'll take her over my grave." The words weren't spoken as a threat, they were delivered as a simple statement of fact, and somehow that made them infinitely more terrifying than any bluster or bravado could have been. The uncle, perhaps recognizing something in Cade's eyes that suggested this was not a man to be trifled with, spat contemptuously into the dirt, wheeled his horse around, and rode off in a cloud of dust and injured pride. He never came back, never again tried to assert his supposed claim over Taya, perhaps understanding finally that some battles aren't worth fighting. That night, as they sat at their simple table sharing their evening meal, Taya's hands trembled as she set her plate down, the emotional weight of the day finally catching up with her. Cade noticed immediately, his attention focused entirely on her welfare. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show, "No one's ever stood for me before." Cade only nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she'd revealed, and replied with simple sincerity, "Now they will." Months passed in relative peace, the rhythm of ranch life providing a soothing backdrop to their growing bond. But the frontier was not a place that allowed peace to last indefinitely. One day, smoke curled ominously on the horizon, a dark smudge against the blue sky that spoke of trouble approaching. Raiders, 4 men riding hard toward the ranch, their intentions written in the aggressive cant of their bodies and the weapons they carried openly. Cade immediately moved into action, saddling his rifle with practiced efficiency, his mind already calculating distances and angles and possibilities. But before he could step outside to meet the threat, Taya wheeled her cart to the door, a shotgun laid across her lap with the comfortable familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "You stay inside," Cade ordered, his protective instincts flaring as he tried to shield her from the danger approaching their home. But Taya shook her head with quiet determination, her jaw set in the stubborn line he'd come to know well. "They'll see I'm no burden," she replied, her voice steady despite the danger, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. There was something in her tone that brooked no argument, something that spoke of a woman who had been underestimated too often and was done being protected from life itself. The raiders rode up with the swagger of men accustomed to taking what they wanted without consequences, their laughter harsh and ugly in the clean air of the ranch. "Heard you got yourself a pet cripple," one of them called out, his words designed to wound and humiliate. "Thought we'd come see what all the fuss is about." The first man, emboldened by his companion's laughter, reached out toward Taya's chair with casual cruelty, perhaps intending to tip her over, or worse. But before Cade could move, before he could even fully raise his rifle, the shotgun in Taya's lap thundered with the voice of judgment itself. The blast tore a hole in the dirt directly at the man's feet, close enough that he could feel the heat of the pellets, close enough that dirt and debris peppered his boots and legs. He stumbled backward, his horse dancing nervously, curses streaming from his mouth, as he fought to regain control of both his mount and his dignity. Taya's voice, when she spoke, was steady as granite, carrying the kind of calm that comes only from absolute certainty. "Next one goes higher," she said simply, the shotgun already reloaded and aimed with unwavering precision. The raiders looked from Taya's steady hands to Cade's rifle, now aimed with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice and absolute resolve. They saw something in both faces that gave them pause, not fear, but determination, not desperation, but strength. They cursed and blustered for a moment longer, but ultimately they were bullies, and bullies prefer easy targets to dangerous ones. They turned their horses and rode off, their laughter now forced and hollow, their swagger somewhat deflated by the encounter with people who refused to be victims. Cade lowered his rifle slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He looked at Taya with something new in his eyes. Not surprise exactly, for he had always known she was strong, but pride, deep and abiding pride in this woman who refused to be anyone's victim. "Good shooting," he said simply, and in those 2 words was a world of respect and admiration that no flowery speech could have conveyed more effectively. As winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, the pace of life slowed to match the season's rhythm. Snow fell in heavy, muffling curtains that transformed the landscape into something magical and strange. Inside their warm home, Taya spent her evenings knitting blankets with hands that had learned to create beauty from simple materials, her fingers working the yarn with meditative precision. Each stitch was placed with care, each pattern chosen with thought, creating not just warmth but art from necessity. Cade built a garden bed for the coming spring, his hands working the wood even in the cold, preparing for growth and renewal even in the depths of winter's grip. One particularly stormy night, with rain drumming against the tin roof like an army of tiny hammers, sleep eluded them both. Taya lay awake in her bed, listening to the familiar sound of Cade's boots as he paced the floor of the main room. The rhythm was restless, troubled, speaking of thoughts that wouldn't settle into peace. Finally, unable to ignore his distress, she called out softly, "What weighs you?" Her voice cut through the sound of rain and wind, reaching across the darkness to offer whatever comfort she could provide. Cade stopped his pacing abruptly, caught in the act of wrestling with demons he thought he'd hidden well. For years he'd kept his deepest grief locked away in the dark corners of his heart, sharing his pain with no one, carrying his burdens alone as he believed a man should. But tonight, with the storm raging outside and this remarkable woman offering to listen, something inside him finally gave way. The walls he'd built around his heart cracked, and the words he'd never spoken aloud came pouring out like water through a broken dam. "I wanted to quit once," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, much less express. "When the fever took my wife, when I watched her slip away and couldn't do anything to save her. When the crib sat empty and the house echoed with might-have-beens. I wanted to lay down in the river and let it take me, let the water wash away the pain and the loneliness and the guilt that I wasn't strong enough to save the people I loved most." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and painful. Taya's voice, when she responded, was soft as velvet but strong as steel. "But you didn't," she observed, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his strength even in his darkest moment. "No," he agreed, his voice growing steadier as he spoke, "because maybe someone stronger than me was still out there. Someone who needed what little I had to give, someone who could teach me that surviving isn't the same as living." He paused, gathering courage for words that had been building in his heart for months. "And I found her," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs as the meaning of his words sank in. For the first time since they'd known each other, her eyes filled with tears. Not tears of pain or frustration or grief, but tears of hope, of joy, of a love she'd never dared dream she might experience. The rain continued its percussion against the roof. But inside their small home, something profound and beautiful was being born in the space between their hearts. When spring finally broke winter's hold on the land, it brought with it a renewal that seemed to touch everything, including their souls. Sunflowers rose in the garden Cade had planted specifically for Taya, their golden faces turning toward the sun with the kind of stubborn optimism that refuses to be defeated by circumstances. Yellow blooms reached toward the sky like prayers made visible, each one a testament to the power of hope and patience and faith in tomorrow. Taya wheeled her cart into the field where the sunflowers stood like a golden army, their beauty overwhelming in its simple perfection. Cade stood waiting among the flowers, and she could see in his posture that this moment was significant, that something important was about to happen. He pulled something from his pocket, a simple silver band, dulled by time and wear, but somehow made more beautiful by its imperfections. The ring caught the sunlight and threw it back in gentle gleams that seemed to dance in the air. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice carefully controlled, but his hands trembling slightly as he held the ring up to the light. "I buried her wearing it, thought it should stay with her forever. But I dreamed she told me to give it to the woman who gave me life again, who taught me that love isn't lost just because it changes form." His eyes met Taya's, and in them she saw not the shadow of his first wife, but a love that was entirely new, entirely hers. Taya's lips parted in shock, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Tears slid down her cheeks unchecked as she whispered the fear that had lived in her heart since the day she'd lost the use of her legs. "But I can't walk." The words came out broken, filled with all the self-doubt and perceived inadequacy that disability had branded into her soul. She couldn't dance at their wedding, couldn't run to him when he came home, couldn't do 1,000 things that she thought a wife should be able to do. Cade knelt beside her cart, bringing himself to eye level, his voice steady and sure as bedrock. "Strength isn't in the legs that carry us," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "It's in the heart that refuses to quit, in the spirit that keeps fighting, even when the world says you're defeated. You're stronger than I'll ever be, Taya. You've survived things that would have broken most people, and you've done it with grace and dignity and courage that humbles me every day. If you'll have me, I'll spend every day of my life proving that I know what real strength looks like." Taya covered her face with her hands, sobbing with a mixture of joy and relief and overwhelming love. All her life she'd been told she was less than, worth less than, wanted less than others. And here was this man, this good and decent man, telling her she was not just enough, but more than he felt he deserved. Through her tears, she nodded, unable to speak, but able to show him that yes, she would have him, would love him, would build a life with him among the sunflowers and hope. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness and loss slowly filled with new sounds, laughter that rang out across the prairie, conversations that stretched late into the evening, the comfortable sounds of people who had found their place in the world and with each other. Word spread throughout the territory, but now the whispers weren't about a cripple being kept out of pity, but about a woman who stood taller sitting down than most men ever did on their feet, about a couple who had found something rare and precious in each other. Years passed like pages in a well-loved book, each one adding depth and richness to their story. The ranch grew and prospered, but more than that, it became something special, a place where broken souls could find healing, where the unwanted could discover their worth. Travelers came, drawn by stories of the couple who took in strays and misfits, who saw value where others saw burden. Broken people found welcome at their table, hope in their example, and proof that love really could conquer the worst that life had to offer. Children eventually ran through those sunflower fields, their laughter bright as summer sunshine, their feet stirring up dust clouds that caught the light like fairy dust. Some were their own, adopted from parents who couldn't care for them. Others were visiting, brought by travelers who knew they'd find kindness here. At night, lanterns glowed warm in the windows of the house that had once stood cold and empty, their light visible for miles across the prairie like a beacon of hope for anyone who needed to know that home was possible. And on the porch, as the sun set each evening in a blaze of orange and gold, Cade and Taya sat side by side, his hand clasped in hers, watching the prairie stretch wide under the endless sky. Their love had grown from those first tentative moments in a dusty market square into something deep and enduring, something that had weathered storms both literal and figurative and emerged stronger for the testing. Once, no one had wanted her. Now, she was the heart of a home, the center of a love story that had become legend in its own small corner of the world. And that, friend, is why Cade Walker said those words that changed everything, words that echo still across the years. "She's stronger than I'll ever be." If you've listened this far, perhaps these words have found their target. Perhaps you needed to hear them too. Maybe you've felt discarded like an unwanted burden, underestimated by those who should have known better, dismissed as less than worthy of love and respect. But the truth that Cade saw so clearly remains as true today as it was then. Strength isn't found in the body that carries us, or in the wealth we accumulate, or in the world's fickle opinion of our worth. Real strength lives in the spirit that refuses to break, in the heart that keeps loving despite being hurt, in the soul that keeps hoping even when hope seems foolish. If you want more true tales of grit and determination, of love that conquers circumstances, of second chances that bloom into something beautiful, then you've found your home here with us. This is where the forgotten find their voice, where the stories of the overlooked and underestimated are told with the respect they deserve, where the unwanted become unforgettable. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and ride with us into the next story, because there are more tales to tell, more proof that the human spirit is stronger than any circumstance, more evidence that love really can change everything.